My name is Derek Langston. I'm 33 years old, and for the past 8 years, I've been teaching 3rd grade at Westfield Elementary in Kansas City, Missouri. When my wife, Madison, said, "It's my body. You don't get to demand anything from me," we had been married for exactly 5 weeks and 2 days. In that short time, she hadn't let me touch her. Not a kiss that lasted more than a second. Not holding hands while we watched TV. Nothing. I sat on our brown leather couch, the one I'd bought 3 years ago when I thought I'd be alone forever, and tried to make sense of her words. We had dated for 14 months. We talked about everything. We were intimate before the wedding. We even lived together for 6 months before we got married. But the moment we said "I do" at St. Catherine's Chapel, something changed. "Madison, I'm not demanding anything," I said. "I'm just asking why you won't even kiss me goodnight." She didn't look up from her phone. "I told you, my body, my choice." That phrase had become her go-to response. It was her answer when I asked if we could share the bed instead of her sleeping in the guest room. She used it when I tried to hold her hand at dinner with my parents last Sunday, and when I suggested a weekend trip to celebrate our first month of marriage. "I respect that completely," I said. "But we're married," I thought. "You thought?" Wrong. She still wouldn't look at me. I went to the kitchen and made a sandwich turkey and Swiss on wheat bread. It's the same thing I'd eaten for lunch at school since September. As I stood there chewing, a thought that had been nagging me for weeks finally clicked. Back in March, during one of our premarital counseling sessions with Pastor Williams, Madison had said something that had stuck with me. She'd mentioned that marriage was about security and partnership, not just physical intimacy. At the time, I assumed she meant our connection was deeper than physical attraction. Now, staring at the empty mayonnaise jar I'd forgotten to replace, I wondered if I'd missed something crucial. The woman in our living room felt like a stranger. The Madison I dated would curl up next to me during movies. She'd laugh at my awful jokes about fractions and long division. She'd get up early on Saturdays to make coffee and sit with me while I graded papers. This Madison acted like I was a roommate she'd barely tolerated. Coldness in her voice when she said "you thought wrong" made me realize this wasn't a temporary phase. This was the plan all along. I had met Madison at a teachers' conference 2 years ago. She was a social worker for the school district, handling the tough family situations that teachers like me couldn't deal with alone. She was quiet, thoughtful, and had a way of listening that made you feel truly heard. Our first date was coffee. We talked for 3 hours about everything except work. She told me about growing up in a small Illinois town, how her parents divorced when she was 12, and how she learned early on that people weren't always what they seemed. I shared how teaching had saved me after my dad died in college and how I was close to giving up on finding someone who understood my job was more than just a paycheck. For the first year, everything felt perfect. My mom loved her, which was a huge deal. Madison fit into my life in a way that felt completely natural. But looking back, I could see the signs I'd ignored. She never wanted to talk about the future. Beyond vague statements about building a stable life, when we moved in together, she insisted on separate bank accounts and splitting every expense exactly in half. Even though I made more money and offered to cover more, during our engagement, she focused on wedding details, not on our future as a married couple. When I brought up honeymoon plans or where we'd live long-term, she'd change the subject. When I suggested we could try for kids in a few years, she'd just nod and say, "We'll see." The biggest red flag came during our final counseling session in August. Pastor Williams asked what we were most looking forward to. I talked about building a family and growing old together. Madison said she was looking forward to a stable foundation to build from so she could focus on her career goals. I thought she was just being practical and reserved. Now, watching her scroll through her phone as if I wasn't even in the room, I realized that wasn't nervousness. That was honesty. She'd married me for stability, not love, physical intimacy. She'd shown me was just a performance to close the deal. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in November. I made dinner, we ate in silence, and she went straight to the guest room to read. I sat in the living room staring at the wall where our wedding photos were hung and tried to figure out what I was going to do. Then I remembered something. Pastor Williams had recorded our counseling sessions with our permission, explaining that he sometimes reviewed them. Madison and I had both signed forms agreeing to it. I called him the next morning. "Derek, good to hear from you," he said. "How are you and Madison settling into married life?" "That's actually why I'm calling," I said. "I think Madison was dishonest about her intentions, and I need to know if those recordings still exist." There was a long pause. "Son, that's a serious accusation. What makes you think she told me last night that she never intended to have a physical relationship with me after we got married?" I said. "She said she married me for security, not because she loved me." "Oh, Derek," he said, his voice dropping. "Yes, I still have the recordings. They're kept for 6 months after counseling. If you're considering legal action, you should know that. Since you both consented, they could potentially be used as evidence." That evening, I sat in my car for 20 minutes before going inside. Madison was in the kitchen, heating up leftover soup. "Madison, we need to talk," I said. She didn't look up. "About what?" "Got what you said during our premarital counseling about marriage being about security, not physical intimacy?" She turned around, and for the first time in weeks, I had her full attention. "What about it?" "Pastor Williams recorded those sessions," I said. "You said things in there that contradict everything you're telling me now." Her face went pale. You wouldn't actually use those against me. That's private." I looked at the woman I thought I knew and realized I didn't recognize her at all. "Madison, did you ever intend to have a real marriage with me?" She set down her spoon and crossed her arms. "I gave you what I promised your wife, a partnership. If you expected more than that, that's your problem." I nodded slowly. Okay. "Okay, what?" she said. "Okay, I understand now." I walked to our bedroom, pulled out my laptop, and started researching annulment procedures in Missouri. If Madison wanted a business arrangement, she was about to learn that business arrangements could be dissolved when one party committed fraud. Representation. Missouri law allows an annulment if one spouse conceals important facts that would have prevented the marriage from happening. I handed the papers to Madison that evening. She read through them twice, then looked up at me with something I'd never seen before. Pure rage. "You're actually doing this over sex?" she demanded. "This isn't about sex, Madison," I said. "This is about honesty. Lied to me about what kind of marriage you wanted." She threw the papers on the counter. "I never lied about anything. I told you I valued stability and partnership. You said you were marrying me because I was safe and stable, not because you loved me. You said those exact words during our session in July." Her face. "They were," I said, "until you decided to break our marriage vows 5 weeks after we made them." Madison spent the weekend on the phone. On Monday morning, she was waiting for me in the kitchen with coffee and toast, the first time she'd made breakfast since our honeymoon. "Derek, I think we got off on the wrong foot," she said. "Marriage is an adjustment. Maybe we can work through this." I looked at the woman who had refused to touch me for over a month, now suddenly interested in reconciliation the moment legal papers were involved. "What changed your mind?" I asked. I realized I was too harsh. "Physical intimacy is important," she said, moving closer and putting a hand on my arm. "We can work on it, however you want." I was just scared. For a moment, I almost believed her. This was the Madison I'd dated, and I remembered her words from Tuesday night. "If you expected more than that, that's your problem. Why are you changing your tune now?" I asked. "I'm not changing anything," she said. "I'm trying to save our marriage." "No," I said, gently removing her hand. "You're trying to avoid the legal consequences of fraud." Her face hardened again. "Fine. You want to do this the hard way? My lawyer says you'll never prove fraud. It's your word against mine, and I'll testify that you're lying about those recordings. He says this whole thing is just you being vindictive because you can't handle rejection." I nodded slowly. Okay, what? "Okay, I understand the strategy. You're going to paint me as controlling and abusive." She smiled for the first time in months, but it wasn't the smile I'd fallen for. "The truth is the truth, Derek. You filed for annulment because I wouldn't sleep with you. How do you think that's going to look?" That evening, I called my own attorney, Janet Morris. I have recordings of her admitting she married me for financial security, not love, I explained. She explicitly stated physical intimacy wasn't part of her expectations, and we both consented to the recordings. Janet was quiet for a moment. In that case, you might have a stronger case than your wife's attorney realizes. The next morning, I went to Pastor Williams's office to get copies of the sessions. I reviewed them after you called, he said, handing me a manila envelope. There are things Madison said that I didn't fully understand at the time, but they make more sense now. That evening, I sat in my empty classroom and listened to 6 hours of recordings. What I heard changed everything. In the third session, Pastor Williams asked Madison about previous relationships. She said she preferred relationships where she could maintain independence and focus on her career. When he asked what she looked for in a husband, her response was chilling. Someone stable who won't make emotional demands on me. Someone who will provide security without expecting me to be something I'm not. She added that she thought I would be satisfied with companionship and partnership. In the fifth session, she said marriage was a practical arrangement. And when pressed, she said she wasn't a physically affectionate person and didn't want to be pushed into romantic expectations. But the most damning recording came from the final session. Pastor Williams asked if we had any concerns. Madison said she was relieved to have the security of marriage and that she intended to maintain separate sleeping arrangements, hoping I would understand that physical intimacy wasn't a priority. When the pastor asked if she had discussed this with me, she said, "Not directly, but I've given him signals. If he hasn't picked up on them, we'll address it after the wedding." I turned off the recording and sat in the dark for an hour. Madison hadn't just lied to me. She had planned the entire deception from the beginning. She had counted on me being too nice, too accommodating, too desperate for companionship to demand honesty about what our marriage would actually involve. She had wanted a roommate who would split the bills and provide social respectability while asking for nothing in return. I spent the weekend preparing for the legal battle. Met with Janet, who listened to key excerpts. "Derek," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "In 20 years of family law, I've never seen such clear evidence of premarital fraud. We're not just going to win, we're going to win decisively." Janet explained the next steps. We would file a motion to include the recordings as evidence, along with a detailed timeline of Madison's deceptive behavior. We would also request that she cover all legal costs and return any gifts or benefits she'd received from the fraudulent marriage. If her attorney tries to argue this is about sexual coercion, Janet added, these recordings will completely destroy that narrative. She clearly states multiple times that she married you specifically because she thought you wouldn't demand a physical relationship. That evening, Madison was waiting for me. She had cooked a beautiful pot roast with vegetables. "Derek, I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "Maybe we can go to counseling together and work through this." "Madison, why now?" I asked. "Why didn't you want to build something real 2 months ago?" Her smile faltered slightly. "I told you I was scared. Marriage is a big adjustment." "No," I said quietly. "You weren't scared. You got exactly what you wanted. A husband who would pay half the bills and leave you alone. That's not true." I pulled out my phone and played a 30-second clip from one of our sessions. Madison's voice filled the dining room. "I need someone who understands that I'm not a physically affectionate person. I can be a good wife in terms of partnership and household management. But I don't want to be pushed into romantic expectations that don't come naturally to me." Her face went white. She stood up so quickly her chair fell over. "You can't use those. Those were private conversations. There were conversations where you admitted to planning exactly what you've done to our marriage." I said, "Derek, please. We can work this out. I'll do whatever you want." I looked at the woman who'd spent 2 months refusing to touch me now, offering to do whatever I wanted because she'd been caught in her own lies. "Madison," I said, "what I want is an honest marriage. And you've already proven that's something you can't provide." The court hearing took place on a cold morning in January. Madison arrived with her attorney, who argued that I was trying to punish his client for exercising her right to bodily autonomy. He painted Madison as a victim of spousal pressure. "Your Honor, I'd like to present audio evidence that directly contradicts the defense's characterization." She played selected excerpts from our counseling sessions. Courtroom was silent as Madison's voice calmly explained her plan to deceive me. Judge Henderson asked to hear the recordings again, then looked directly at Madison. Mrs. Langston, these recordings suggest that you entered into marriage with no intention of fulfilling basic marital obligations, and that you deliberately concealed this from your husband. Do you dispute their authenticity? Madison's attorney whispered something to her, but she shook her head. No, Your Honor, but I was just being honest about my feelings. Honest with Pastor Williams, the judge said, but not with your husband. Madison had no answer. Judge Henderson granted the annulment without hesitation. She ruled that Madison had committed fraud by concealing her true intentions and that her deception was grounds for voiding the marriage contract entirely. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering Mrs. Langston to return all gifts received. In connection with this marriage and to pay all court costs and attorney fees, marriage is a legal contract based on mutual understanding and good faith. When one party deliberately deceives the other, they bear responsibility for the consequences. Madison's face crumpled as the reality hit her. She would have to return thousands of dollars in wedding gifts and pay over $10,000 in legal fees. As we left the courthouse, she tried one last time to speak to me. Derek, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I looked at her for what I knew would be the last time. Madison, you meant for it to go exactly this far. You just didn't expect to get caught. Within a month, the truth had spread. The teachers at school who had admired Madison's apparent devotion during our engagement now understood her detachment. My friends, who had thought she was just shy, realized they had witnessed calculated emotional manipulation. Her reputation at the school district suffered, and 6 months later, I heard she had moved back to Illinois. She couldn't rebuild her professional credibility after the truth about her capacity for deception came out. For me, the experience taught me the difference between being understanding and being naive. I had confused Madison's emotional unavailability with depth, her calculation with thoughtfulness. When I eventually started dating again, I knew to look for someone who could be honest about what they wanted. Madison had wanted security without commitment, partnership without intimacy, and marriage without love. What she got instead was a public demonstration that fraud has consequences, even in matters of the heart. Sometimes the most important lesson isn't about love, it's about truth.